Prithvi?
Good evening to all the participants. I welcome Honorable Justice Mr. A.K. Nambiar today for taking this session, and I welcome all the participants from across the country for joining this session today. Uh, on There are a few certain instructions before we start on the session which I would like to share. The entire session will be taken by my lords, and once the session gets over, if if time permits, we can have a question answer round also. But the instructions for question answer round we will follow if we are taking the question answer session round. So I hand over the mic to Natarajan sir for formally welcoming our speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you, Prithvi. Very good evening, Lordship AKJ Nambiarji. So he doesn't need any instruction in the introduction in Chennai. So fortunately, he was one who was practicing in the taxation field. And whenever we go to Bangalore bench of the tribunal, we can always see him there. So he used to regularly appear before the Bangalore bench of the Sistat, High Courts, and Chennai High Court also. And the last time, if I'm able to recollect, that was the time when he came here. There is one case called this metal weld electrodes, where the issue was about the interim orders of the tribunal, that is the pre-deposit orders of the tribunal. Against that, whether a writ will lie or a civil appeal will lie. So that was the issue. There was a batch of matters, and Lordship was leading that as a senior counsel at that point of time. And in fact, that case, when I just saw that citation today, it is a mini webinar of MTB. We can find all the names there. Muthu Venkatraman, Shankar Raman, everybody who has been attending today's session were always there in that particular case also. And it was a very nice experience during that particular time. So on behalf of Madras Tax Bar, when I just approached him to give a webinar to us, and he readily obliged. So even though I had a little hesitation in approaching him and asking for a session, he readily obliged, and he came forward with several topics also. And he suggested this will be one of the best topic, and we also liked it. And that is how it got fixed almost a week back. And we had a very smooth sailing all along, very easy to coordinate with him. And when I just talked to some of my friends in Kerala, so because I may have to introduce him to tell me something, all of them have said a lot of good about the Lordship, the way he conducts a court, the speed in which all the matters are being disposed. And the last day before the Christmas vacation, when he sat, almost 200 matters were finished with the proper orders in a matter of 1 hour. So people used to recollect, and I also requested the Kerala Bar also to join today's session. And coming, so with all this, I just welcome Lordship to our session, and I thank him for having accepted our invitation. I thank all the friends who have joined today's session. And coming to this particular topic, it is very relevant in the current day context. When the role of the government is expanding, and more legislations are being passed by the parliament, and especially at a time when most of the time of the parliament is being wasted on more of political discussion rather than the legislative business, there is always a tendency on the there is actually, it is there or not, we have to see in various spheres. So the executive may try to bulldoze the provisions and try to assure more powers by way of delegated legislation. So as a guardians of the rule of law, we the advocates have to be very, very careful whenever the power of delegation is given in any statute, to what extent the power has been given and how that power has been used. And whenever there is any breach of rule of law, we have to be very, very careful. So in that context, today's topic becomes very, very important. And we all know, last 2 days before, when we conducted another session on tribunalization, we know that how this entity rules were framed. So the statute, the National Tax Tribunal statute, was almost a hollow statute, and leaving everything for the executive to frame everything by virtue of rules. And ultimately, Supreme Court has to strike it down on the ground of excessive delegation. So the topic is very important, and we will all be benefited out of this lecture, certainly. So with this small introduction, I invite, I heartily welcome Lordship Jaishankar Nambiar to our MTB. And over to you, Lordship.
Thank you, Natarajan, for those nice words of introduction. Thank you also to Prithvi for commencing the proceedings. Natarajan, for some curious reason, your WhatsApp profile shows your name as Nuts. Now, I sincerely hope that after this adventure of yours, where you called me here as a speaker, that name won't stick with you to haunt you for the rest of your life. the Madras bar, tax bar in particular, is a place I've always enjoyed being. I have so many friends because my association with Madras tax bar started somewhere in the early 90s when I used to come regularly as a junior lawyer before the tribunal, before the SIGAT as it was then called. And the association has been a pleasant one, a most enjoyable one, and no matter what people in this country may talk about when they refer to the Madras bar and the problems that they face, for me, and I was telling this to Ramesh yesterday, for me, Madras bar is something I treasure close to my heart. The topic that I've chosen to speak on today may surprise many who probably know me better as an indirect tax lawyer more than anything else. To be frank, I was exploring talking on various other subjects, but then to my horror, I discovered that the Madras tax bar had already held lectures on almost every possible topic under the sun. And therefore, there was precious little that I could explore in indirect tax. And even when it came to constitution and writs, I think Ramesh beat me to it. He went and spoke on writ jurisdiction. So that left me with a topic which I had spoken on recently in Kerala, which is the delegated legislation and control. And when I offered to speak on that, I was surprised because I was surprised by the reaction of many because there seems to be a large amount of interest shown in this particular topic. And I'm not surprised because in my view, this is one topic that has been more or less neglected among the legal fraternity. And I thought it was important that we sort of revive our interest on this particular topic. Now, administrative law generally as a topic is one that I would lay considerable emphasis, primarily because it is my view that if you want to become a successful lawyer in India, you need to be proficient in three vital areas of law. One is constitutional law, the second is administrative law, and the third is interpretation of statutes. Now, without these three, you may be an expert in any of the individual fields of law, but without these three to ground you, you do not get the necessary expertise to become a practicing lawyer. So administrative law and all its branches or all its facets are necessary to be inculcated in every lawyer who wants to make a mark in the field of litigation in India. The other reason I chose this topic was to share some of my concerns with regard to the law in this area, and basically to introspect on the question as to whether we are heading in the right direction in terms of laying down the law for the future generation. Let me give you a little bit background of the development of administrative law, because you do not understand the necessity for delegated legislation, you do not understand the scope of delegated legislation unless you set it at the backdrop of administrative law development in general. Administrative law, as you all know, developed primarily after the interest that was shown in probably the early 19th century to the principle of laissez-faire, which is basically empowering the private enterprise to various functions of the government and lesser regulation with a mandate that there would not be too much of control over their functioning. Now, this was felt necessary because it was traditional governments were incapable of discharging all the functions that were required for society. So private enterprise began to play an important role in regulating most of the functions of governance for society. The difficulty was that people soon became disenchanted with this laissez-faire doctrine because the private enterprise, as we all know, is focused more on amassing of the wealth, exploitation of citizens, etc. So the care for public interest was not seen during those years of laissez-faire. And therefore, it was inevitable and indeed it did transpire, that the functions of government were restored, basic functions that had to be discharged by the government were restored back to the government and taken away from the private enterprise. Now, this in turn led to the necessity for having principles that would regulate the exercise of power by the governmental authorities, and also to have principles whereby government would be forced to resort to affirmative action to protect the interests of the citizens. So it is basically a set of rules which lay down not only limitations on the exercise of power by government, it is also a set of rules which empower the government to direct the government to take affirmative action in areas where that is required. But if you look at the gamut of the law or the principles that have been laid down over the years, you will find that administrative law is essentially nothing but a set of rules which ensure fairness in government action vis-a-vis the citizens that it is regulating. Now, with that short introduction, let's get straight into what are the who are the authorities that we talk about when we talk about administrative law and the statutes. Now, administrative authorities fall broadly under three categories. The first is what you would call as quasi-legislative authorities. The second would be quasi-judicial authorities. And the third would be purely administrative authorities. Now, the distinction is crucial because you need to know the power which is being exercised by the various authorities before you challenge any action. I'm talking about the practical aspect of a challenge in a court. You need to understand the power that is exercised by each of them so that you can formulate your grounds of challenge, and they are different for the different kinds of authorities. Quasi-legislative authorities, when we say quasi-legislative authorities, we mean authorities who are conferred with the power under the statute, which is essentially a part of the legislative power itself, by which the statute itself was enacted. So a portion of the legislative power, which is conferred on the legislative body, is delegated to the delegate under the statute, and he exercises that legislative power in continuation of the power exercised by the parent body. So that's a quasi-legislative authority, and he's called quasi-legislative because he's not actually the legislative body. The second is a quasi-judicial. Now, you could have some authorities or delegates under the Act who have to exercise a power which effectively determines the inter se rights between citizens or between the citizen and the state. Now, a modicum of adjudication happens of rights, and therefore those bodies which are concerned with the adjudication of the respective inter se rights between persons are called the quasi-judicial because they're exercising a judicial function of adjudication. But yet they are not the judicial body like a court or a tribunal. The third is a purely administrative authority. Now, this is fairly straightforward because he does nothing more than implement the provisions of the Act. He is basically like an agent who is executing the orders of the principal. So these are the three broad categories of administrative authorities that we would find in any statute that is enacted by the legislature. Now, what is delegated legislation? The simplest definition and probably the best definition of a delegated legislation can be found in Halsbury's Laws of England. And it only says that when an instrument of a legislative nature is made by an authority in exercise of power delegated or conferred by a legislature, it is called delegated or subordinate legislation. It's very simple. The instrument must be of legislative nature. In other words, it must be as an exercise of a legislative power. And the power must be delegated to the person by the parent statute. And the resultant product or that instrument would then be called a delegated legislation. Now, the question is often asked, do we actually require delegated legislation? Now, you all know that under our constitution, in India, we operate on a principle of separation of powers. And of course, not a strict separation of powers as advocated by persons like Montesquieu, but we have a separation of powers which is informed by another principle of checks and balances. So you have the legislature legislating and making the laws, you have the executive implementing the laws, and you have the judiciary, which is entrusted with the task of adjudicating upon the rights of citizens. Now, each of these bodies functions within the realm that is allotted to them under the Constitution. But you need to have a check on the excesses or the shortcomings of the other. And therefore, we have this principle of checks and balances, whereby each of these bodies in turn checks the excesses of the other, or even supplements the functioning of the other. This is the principle that we've grown up with and we've been working under our Constitution. Now, when you look at a concept of delegated legislation, we are essentially talking about a legislative body delegating a legislative function to another. This would prima facie appear to be anti or against the principle of separation of powers, strict separation of powers, because the legislature is meant to legislate, and if it is abdicating its legislative function, then it is violating the principle of separation of powers, and it is essentially a fraud on the Constitution. But you have to understand what reality is, because governing a society has not been a piece of cake. So almost every jurisdiction in the world and every legislation all over the world would have provisions which delegate some functions of legislation to an authority under the particular legislation. And today, I think it can safely be said that it is a compulsive necessity. Delegated legislation is a compulsive necessity. Some may even go to the extent of saying that it is a necessary evil. But delegated legislation is here to stay. As a principle in administrative law, it is there to stay. And we have, therefore, to concentrate on what best we can do to ensure that the powers that are conferred on a delegate are not misused in any manner. Now, the principle of separation of powers, as I said, has to be guarded, and therefore, when you delegate the power when you delegate the legislative functions to a delegate, it is necessary to put in place a set of controls. But before we go into the controls of delegated legislation per se, we need to understand the difference between what is referred to as a delegated legislation and sometimes referred to as conditional legislation. Now, these are two different things, although, and why I'm emphasizing on this is because when you look at a particular clause in a statute, or a particular provision in a statute, there could be a lot of confusion between or as to whether this is basically a clause which empowers a delegate to exercise a legislative power, or is it something that he's merely to do the legislative power having already been exhausted by the parent legislation. The distinction between the two is that in the case of a conditional legislation, and I'll give you examples of what conditional legislation are. In the case of a conditional legislation, the legislative power is entirely exercised by the parent legislative body. What is left to the delegate is only minor things like determining the extent of time during which the statute should operate, or determining the areas over which the statute should operate, etc. In the case of delegated legislation, on the other hand, there is an element of the legislative power that is delegated to the delegate under the statute, and he exercises a portion of the legislative power that is conferred on the legislative body. This is a crucial difference. And why is it a crucial difference? Some of the grounds which are available for setting aside an administrative act would not be available when you're challenging a delegated legislation. The straight example that comes to mind is, or straight instance that comes to mind is when you challenge the delegate, when you challenge a rule or an order on the ground that it is violative of the rules of natural justice. In other words, persons have not been heard, affected persons have not been heard before the order was passed. Now, if it is a conditional legislation, then it is not a legislative power that is being exercised, and therefore it would be controlled by the principles of natural justice, there would be read in by the courts a necessity of consulting the other side before passing the order that is prejudicial to that person's interest. In the case of a delegated legislation, however, because it is essentially a legislative function, the rules of natural justice, like the requirement of hearing before passing an order, do not apply, because in legislation we don't have the principles of natural justice coming in unless it is expressly provided for in the statute. So the distinction between conditional legislation and delegated legislation is one that has to be borne in mind. The other area or pitfall, if I can call it, is nomenclature, because very often the words used by administrative authorities or the government are ambiguous. They would refer invariably to rules, regulations, circulars, orders, guidelines. The nomenclature by itself does not determine the character of the instrument. So it is important because, as I said earlier, if the instrument concerned is not a piece of is not a legislative instrument, then the grounds on which you're going to be challenging it are entirely different from what you would if the instrument was of legislative character. So with that broad distinction between the instruments of delegated legislation and conditional legislation, let's go on to the test of delegated legislation itself. Now, before that, let me just give you the two decisions that deal with conditional legislation. And I think it is important for those of you who are academically inclined. The first is a decision called King Emperor and versus Banwarilal Sharma. The citation is AIR 1945 Privy Council, page 48. AIR 1945 Privy Council, page 48. And the second decision is Inder Singh and versus State of Rajasthan. And the citation is AIR 1957 Supreme Court, page 510. That's AIR 1957 Supreme Court, page 510. Now, brief facts in the first one, that is Banwarilal Sharma, was that there was an ordinance by the Governor General constituting special courts. And the ordinance had made it clear that the special courts were to function in particular areas in respect of certain kind of offences. There was a power that was delegated under the legislation, under the ordinance, to the provincial governments to extend the duration of the ordinance in case of emergency by a particular period as determined by the provincial governments. The question was whether this amounted to a delegated legislative power. And the answer given by the Privy Council was that it was in the negative. They said it was not, because the legislation had already been exercised. Legislative power had already been exhausted by the executive in that case, because it was an ordinance. They had already laid down all the policy, the objectives behind the ordinance. And the only limited function that the provincial government had was to decide upon whether the ordinance should be extended by a further period in the case of an emergency. And this did not amount to an exercise of a legislative power. The second case, which is Inder Singh, concerned another ordinance, which is the Rajasthan Tenants Protection Ordinance. Here again, the ordinance was promulgated for a period of 2 years, but there was an authority given to the governor to extend the ordinance by a further period by issuing a notification. Similar reasoning, similar conclusion, but this time by the Supreme Court, following the Banwarilal Sharma's case, and said the legislative power had already been exhausted by through the enactment of the ordinance. The promulgation for a further period of 2 years was only an act done in a matter of conditional legislation. Right. Now, what are the limitations that one has in the case of delegated legislation? Essentially, the first limitation, which is basically a takeoff on the doctrine of separation of powers, is that in a delegated legislation, the essential functions cannot be delegated to a delegate. And this is basically saying that, look, when you have been entrusted with the task of bringing out a legislation, do not bypass or do not abdicate your responsibilities by asking somebody else to do it. And therefore, even if you were to do it, ensure that the basic legislation is done by you and your agent does only what they call filling in the gaps. So essential functions cannot be delegated. What they mean is that the broad policy that informs the legislation, the objectives of the legislation, the machinery, essential machinery required for the purposes of attaining those objects, etc., must be provided for in the parent statute or basic legislation itself. You cannot say the bare minimum in the parent legislation and leave it to a delegate to determine the basic policy principles, etc. So this is the essence of the limitation with regard to essential functions. Two decisions for those who want to go through it. 1996 3 SCC 741. 1996 3 SCC 741. It's a case called Mahi Beach Trading Company versus Union Territory of Puducherry. And the second one is 1997 5 SCC 516, which is a case called Agricultural Market Committee versus Shalimar Chemical Works. I would seriously recommend these two decisions for your reading because it gives you the essence of what are called the essential functions and which cannot be delegated to another authority under the statute. The second decision, the Shalimar Chemicals, was basically a case involving the Agricultural Marketing Committee constituted in somewhere in Andhra Pradesh. The statute provided that the Agricultural Marketing Committee could be given powers to levy a fee in respect of sale or purchase of agricultural products within the notified area that was determined under the statute. Now, the Agricultural Marketing Committee, taking on the powers that were conferred on it, levied fees in respect of not only the items of agricultural commodities that was sold or purchased or sold within the notified area. They went on to even levy a fee in respect of the weighing or the measurement of the agricultural commodities within the notified area. In other words, and in that particular case, it was a case where agricultural commodities had been purchased from Kerala and taken to Andhra Pradesh and brought to the notified area. And in the notified area, they were merely weighed and counted, and the sale and purchase had already happened in Kerala. The fee was levied in respect of even those activities. And the question was whether that amounted to, if it was to be justified as a fee, whether that would amount to excessive delegation. The answer given by the Supreme Court was that yes, because if there was to be a fee in respect of weighing and counting also, that was something that had to be determined by the parent legislative body and not by the delegate or rule-making authority. It was therefore said that it was a case of excessive delegation if that was to be sustained. However, if you look at it another way, this case could also have been decided on the principles of ultra vires, because this was a straightforward case of the delegate acting beyond the provisions of the statute, because the statute did not authorize a levy in respect of weighment and counting. The delegate obviously could not have done it. The second limitation you have in respect of delegated legislation is a principle that a delegate cannot sub-delegate. Now, this is again fairly straightforward, because when I ask you to do something, I don't expect you to sub-delegate it to somebody else. The principle of delegatus non potest delegare. The only exception to that rule is, suppose the parent statute itself authorizes the sub-delegation, then of course the sub-delegation is permitted under those circumstances. The third limitation is what we refer to as Henry VIII clauses. Now, this basically means that the delegate cannot be conferred with greater powers than the parent authority itself had. It is called a Henry VIII clause. Wherever you find such things, it is called a Henry VIII clause, because it takes its name after the autocratic regent in England, Henry VIII. He's known for more reasons than that. Henry VIII was autocratic in his rule, and he did it under cover of law. That is the charm of it all. Henry VIII used to bank upon a statute, which is called the Statute of Declarations. Under the Statute of Declarations, there was a clause that empowered the regent to make rules and regulations, etc. And those rules and regulations extended to even a power to amend or repeal the statute itself under which he was created. So, if you were to take an analogy in Hindu mythology, you would refer to this not as the Henry VIII clause, you would call it the Bhasmasura clause, right? So, this is basically conferring a power on the delegate, which is more than what the parent statute can enact in itself. Now, Henry VIII clauses in India, it is frowned upon, obviously. But I must tell you that across various countries in Europe and America, you do find Henry VIII clauses in statutes, and they are perfectly legal, because sometimes you require a Henry VIII clause permitting an amendment to a parent statute simply because the legislative process of amending an enactment might take time and might involve a lot of resources, which can be overcome through grant of a power to the lower authority, to the subordinate authority to amend. Now, this happens. For example, there are a couple of statutes in Britain where, after the framing of the law, there was a power given to the statutory authority to amend the parent statute in the event of higher law coming in at a later point of time. And now, all of you know, in Britain, they came under the regime of the European Conventions. And when the European Conventions came, there had to be corresponding changes or amendments made to the local law. And that was possible through the Henry VIII clauses there. The difficulty with Henry VIII clauses is you require people of sterling character and integrity and to be manning those posts or exercising those functions under a statute. And unless you're very sure that it will always be held by such persons, toying with a Henry VIII clause can be a dangerous proposition. And it's probably for that reason that in India, we frown upon such clauses. The last of the limits or controls on delegated legislation is the principle of ultra vires. This is fairly well known to most of the practicing lawyers, as all of you are, which is that the delegate must always conform to the discipline or the objects of the parent statute. So there's no question of the delegate straying beyond the parent statute. He has to conform with the rigor and the objects of the statute. He must therefore not do anything which the statute does not authorize him to do. Right. Now, we know what the limits on delegated legislation are. Now, we come to the control of delegated legislation. And it is here that, contrary to what most people assume, I would like to focus on something else. Control of delegated legislation. When we talk about control of delegated legislation, we lawyers and judges, we are arrogant. We tend to think that, you know, the judiciary is the panacea for all evils. And this is where I want to highlight that control of delegated legislation need not necessarily be by the judiciary alone. Control of delegated legislation has traditionally and always should be both by the judiciary in circumstances where it is warranted, but principally, I believe that there should be a control of delegated legislation by the legislature itself, by the legislative body itself. And the statutes which we have in force in our country today have those clauses which aim at controlling delegated legislation. The difficulty that we have been facing is that these clauses have been interpreted by the judiciary in such a manner that it enables the legislature, parent legislative body to get away with either shoddy legislation or does not hold the legislative body to the requirement of control of the delegated legislation in the manner that would be desirable. I'll come to that in a minute. But let us understand what are the controls that are provided in the statute, legislative controls that are provided in the statute. The provision, for example, some statutes have a procedure, lay down a procedure, which has to be followed by the delegate while making a rule or while making a regulation. Those procedures may sometimes provide for a consultation with the affected parties. So you have a situation where the statute says that there shall be a rule. The statute also tells the delegate that before making the rule, you enter into a consultation process with the relevant stakeholders, and then invite their objections before you and finalize it only after considering those objections. A straight case which comes to mind is probably under the Motor Vehicles Act, Central Motor Vehicles Act. You have a provision for framing a scheme by the state governments for providing the monopoly, etc., to the state undertakings. Now, those schemes have to be, there are a set of rules. The rules themselves can be framed only after consultation or putting the draft rules in the public domain, calling for the objections, and then only finalizing. So this is one safeguard which is provided by the statute itself. And it informs the delegate at the time of making the rule that there is a procedure to be followed, a procedure which ensures fairness in the action of the authority in making the rule concerned. That's the first one. The second most important clause, and this is very commonly found in our statutes, is the procedure which requires the rules framed by the rulemaking authority to be laid before the legislature. Now, why would you have a procedure for laying the rules made by a subordinate authority before the parent legislative body? It is nothing but a supervision of the delegation. And when there is a provision for laying the rules before the legislative body, I would think that that is something that is prescribed in the statute as a safeguard against arbitrary action by the arbitrary or illegal action by the delegate. So if the statute itself provides for it, the legislative intention is that this would be overseen by the legislature. Now, when problems arise, when we decide on an interpretation of this particular clause, that the laying procedure is not mandatory, it is only directory. The minute you do that, the control that is envisaged by the legislature in the legislation is done away with. So this is another area of concern. Third, you have provisions under the statute which say that as and when rules are made by the rulemaking authority, those rules must be published. The requirement of publication of the rules has to be seen as mandatory. Why should it be seen as mandatory? It has to be seen as mandatory because you work under a general law which presumes that the citizens of this country know the law. You've all heard it mentioned in parrot-like fashion, ignorance of law is not an excuse. How do you expect a citizen to know the law unless it is published? So a rulemaking authority has to publish those rules, and it has to be mandated that those rules are published, because otherwise there's no way that a citizen is going to know what those rules are. The fourth category of controls, which is now coming into prominence, although not mentioned in the legislation itself, is the constitution of subcommittees within the legislature. The legislative body itself constitutes subcommittees, which would then go around monitoring the rulemaking by the rulemaking authority and would see whether the rulemaking authority has adhered to the principles and the objects of the statute while making those rules. Now, this is a procedure which the legislative body itself has devised for controlling the legislation. And in my opinion, this is something that has to be encouraged in future, because it will ensure that the legislature, which is the body that is entrusted with the task of making laws in our country, will be more careful when it legislates. Secondly, when there is an authority given to another body, a subordinate body, to make rules in compliance with the legislation, which other body will be more competent to see whether this rule accords with the objectives of the parent legislation than the parent legislature itself? So when the legislature itself constitutes subcommittees and monitors the rulemaking exercise, there is no greater safeguard as far as we are concerned with regard to the making of the laws. And I say this is important because over the years, we've started noticing a rather disturbing trend in governance, which is that the legislative exercise is very shoddily done. The executive does not do what it has supposed to do. Everything is left to the judiciary to oversee, and whenever there is interference, it has reached a stage where the other bodies do not act, and that cannot be desirable in under any constitution or under any jurisdiction. I'll give you straightaway examples of legislative inaction. Take, for example, and this is my favorite, and anybody who's heard me speak before will immediately relate to it, the Vishaka case. The Vishaka case was in 1996 when the Supreme Court laid down guidelines as to the principles that must be observed at the time in order to determine sexual harassment of a woman at her workplace. There was no law that we had the offences defined under the Indian Penal Code, and there was no specific law to deal with this particular evil that was noticed in society. Now, when there is an evil noticed in society, you would expect the legislative body to act because they are the representatives of the people, and they are the ones who are entrusted with the task of making a law. When the law is not made, the judiciary has to step in because somebody has to do it. So this was the background, this was the circumstances under which the judiciary came up with guidelines that would guide not only the society in general, but would also guide the legislature into the principles for enacting a legislation to combat the evil. The curious thing is, the guidelines of the Supreme Court were in 1996, if I'm not mistaken. Vishaka was 1996. The legislation itself came in 2013. Now, if it takes 17 years for the legislature to wake up and act in respect of a social evil that was discovered 17 years ago, then that is not a healthy state of affairs under the Constitution. And you are basically, it is a straight case of the legislative body abdicating its essential functions and leaving it to another body to do the damage control. Vishaka is not the sole instance of legislation coming late. The People's Union for Civil Liberty, where the food security laws were talked about, the guidelines came by the Supreme Court sometime in 2000. The legislation came in 2010. So, and I can multiply the examples of belated legislation coming in. But the point here is that the legislative, if the legislative bodies are to be encouraged or have to be prodded to do their job, then you need to take into account these clauses which are already there and ensure that the legislature acts accordingly. Now, the other control of which we are all too familiar are the judicial control of delegated legislation. Essentially, judicial control of delegated legislation only ensures that the delegated legislation conforms to the limitations that are required in the exercise of the power of delegation. And therefore, we ask ourselves whether the essential functions have been delegated. If that is answered in the affirmative, the legislation, the rule straight away goes. If it is answered in the negative, then you go on to see whether the delegate has acted in excess of his powers. Now you're seeing whether the doctrine of ultra vires is attractive. The third and the most important area that we focus upon is whether the rules, the instrument of subordinate legislation, go against the provisions of the Constitution. It's again ultra vires if it goes against the provisions of the Constitution, because the Constitution is the parent enactment in our country. But what has to be borne in mind is subordinate legislation must also conform to other plenary legislation, and not only when you talk about ultra vires, you're not talking only about the rule going against the provisions of the Constitution or the rule going against the provisions of the parent statute under which it was made. It has also to be in conformity with any other plenary legislation. So it is not only the legislation under which it was enacted or rules were framed, the rules must also conform to any other statute which has been enacted. Now this is often lost track of, And you will find that these principles have been laid down quite recently, recently in the sense 2006, by the Supreme Court in 2 cases. And I would seriously recommend that for your reading. One is 2006 4 SCC 327. It's a case called Kerala Samastha Chettu Tozhilali Union, basically the Toddy Tappers Union. 2006 4 SCC 327. And the second one, closer home for all of you, is State of Tamil Nadu versus Krishnamurthy, which is 2006 4 SCC 517. Now, the principles of judicial control over delegated legislation are succinctly enumerated in both these decisions. But one of the things that they mention is also that not only should it be in conformity with the statute under which it was framed, it should also be in conformity with any other plenary legislation. The fourth aspect of control comes through the application of the tests of what is the judicial review tests, which we apply in courts: illegality, irrationality, procedural impropriety, Wednesbury unreasonableness, and proportionality. Now, illegality is straightforward if it offends any provision of law, whether it is the law laid down by the basic legislation or whether it is the Constitution or any other plenary legislation. Irrationality is the rule unreasonable. The question asked is whether it is unreasonable. Procedural impropriety, as I said, if there is a requirement under the statute that before framing the rules, you have to comply with the rules of natural justice, and if you don't, then that's a straight case of procedural impropriety. Otherwise, if the statute mandates that the rule making has to be done following a particular procedure and you don't follow that, that is an aspect of striking down the rule. Wednesbury unreasonableness, all of you know, you're basically asking the question as to whether the statutory authority took into account the relevant facts which are necessary for the exercise of the rulemaking power. Did it ignore the irrelevant facts? And even if both these were done, was the decision of the authority something that was so unreasonable that no reasonable man would arrive at it? That is the essence of Wednesbury unreasonableness. And the last one, and not the least, is the doctrine of proportionality. Now, proportionality is basically a safeguard against what we would refer to as an overkill. In other words, you do not interfere with the legislative exercise if it is not required to be interfered with, or you will interfere with the legislative exercise if the legislative exercise has resulted in addressing a problem in society to a greater extent than what is normally required for the purposes of addressing. Now, for those of you who are interested in the recent decision which dwells on proportionality as a criteria, is the judgment of Justice Nariman, Rohinton Nariman, in the cryptocurrency case. I'm not sure whether it is reported in the SCC itself, but it's on SCC online. The citation is 2020 SCC online SC 275. 2020 SCC online Supreme Court 275. The cryptocurrency case was essentially dealing with an instruction that was given by the RBI to the banking institutions, and they were asked not to deal with or provide services to enable dealing in cryptocurrencies or virtual currencies. The circular itself was challenged inter alia on the ground that this was not, this was ultra-wise. And also, the Supreme Court also considered whether, even if it was within the powers of the RBI to issue such a circular, whether it was a disproportionate exercise that they did. To cut the long story short, what the Supreme Court essentially held was that it was well within the powers of the RBI to issue the circular, because it was within the realm of regulation by the RBI. But the actual exercise by the RBI of this power, they went overboard because they did not have enough material to show that the tests to show that there was a serious affecting of the public interest through the dealing in cryptocurrencies. So on the principle of proportionality, the circular was struck down. But on the question of whether it was within the powers of the RBI to issue the circular, it was answered in the affirmative. Now, what are my concerns? And this is something that I would lay before you for your consideration. As I said earlier, the number of instances where the courts are called upon to interfere with a decision of the adjudicating authority or the quasi-legislative or the quasi-judicial authorities or even the administrative authority are rising. Normally in courts, when exercising judicial review under Article 226, we exercise what is called the secondary review. In other words, we wait for the primary authority to act and then review his actions by applying the tests of judicial review. There are instances, of course, where we do resort to what we call a primary review, which is we substitute the view taken by the administrative authority or the quasi-judicial and with our own views. Largely, this is done only when we find that there is a violation of a constitutional right, fundamental right, say discrimination, Article 14, when it comes to discrimination. Otherwise, for the large part, we resort only to a secondary review. Now, the whole functioning of judicial review would be turned on its head if every administrative authority was to abdicate his role of deciding a matter and leaving it to the court in exercise of its secondary review to take the very decision which the administrative authority or the quasi-judicial authority ought to have taken in the first instance. Now, this, therefore, is something that has to be curbed. And we cannot afford to, because our courts are already packed and the volumes of litigation that we deal with in our courts in our country are not dealt with in any other country in the world. And therefore, there is a growing necessity to ensure that the constitutionally entrusted bodies perform within the roles that they are asked to or mandated to perform. In that backdrop, if courts were to interpret provisions under the statute, which are intended to ensure a control by the legislature of delegated legislation in such a manner that we overlook or we shut our eyes to certain patent irregularities by giving it a wider interpretation or a liberal interpretation, then the march of the law cannot be in a direction that is desirable. And I want to emphasize on this the principle that essential functions cannot be delegated. And I want to show that through 3 cases, which I would recommend, just to show the shift in judicial thinking that had happened when it came to interpreting the provisions in a statute which require that essential legislative functions should not be delegated. The first is a case called Jalan Trading Company versus Mil Mazdoor Sabha. The citation is AAR 1967, Supreme Court 691. AAR 1967, Supreme Court 691. Now, that was a case which arose under the Payment of Bonus Act, 1965. Section 37 of the Act authorized the central government to issue orders for removing difficulties. You find these provisions in very many other statutes. You have an authority that is conferred with the power to remove difficulties, right? And giving effect to the provisions of the Act. The Supreme Court, while considering in Jalan, said that this clause straightaway offends the principle of excessive delegation. So it said that while interpreting Section 37, the Supreme Court was of the view that the central government was effectively asked to determine the object of the Act and then issue orders to remove difficulties. This was basically the delegate performing the function of determining what the object of the Act was and then taking a call as to how the difficulties would be removed. This cannot be function of a delegate. The legislature has to specify what is the object of the act in very clear terms so as to guide the delegate. The delegate cannot be determining what the object of the legislation was. So in Jalan trading, in my view, rightfully so, the Supreme Court said that this amounted to an excessive delegation. But look what happened barely a decade after that. In Kerala State Electricity Board versus Indian Aluminium Company Limited, and the citation is 1976 1 SCC 466. 1976 1 SCC 466. That was a case which involved the validity of the Kerala State Electricity Supply, Kerala State Electricity Board Licensing Area Surcharge Order of 1968. This is basically a subordinate legislation which was passed in exercise of powers under the Kerala Essential Articles Act. The nomenclature of the statute is not important, but what is important is that the parent statute, defined an essential article as any article that may be defined by the government as an essential article. Right? Now, if you compare this with the facts in Jalan, which I just stated, this would be a straight case where the government is asked to determine the very object of the statute. Curiously, however, the provision was upheld by the court, which said, a majority of the court, which said that the act had already laid down a policy to guide the discretion of the administrative authority in determining what is an essential article. Of course, there was a dissenting judgment also, which took the view that there was no standard or policy mentioned in the act, which would guide the administrative authority or the rulemaking authority in deciding what an essential article was. Now, the point here is, if there is an ambiguity even among the judges on the bench with regard to this, would it not have been better to actually hold that this was an excessive delegation? There was an ambiguity with regard to whether or not the parent legislative body had informed or had laid down the guidelines to inform the administrative authority or the rulemaking authority. Now, if there was confusion even at the highest level with regard to whether or not a policy was in fact laid down by the legislature, would it have been a more prudent course of action to say that there was an excessive delegation and the legislature ought to revisit this and make suitable amendments? That would have been a better, in my opinion, that would have been a better course of action, because that would be encouraging the legislature to come out with the essential attributes of the legislation and leaving the delegate or the rulemaking authority only with the task of dealing with the minor details, filling in the details as it were. The third decision which arose was 1979 1 SCC 137. This is a case called Avinder Singh versus State of Punjab, 1979 1 SCC 137. Now, this again was a case similar to that. I'm not going detailed into the facts, but there again, you find that the court interpreted the word "for the purposes of the act" rather liberally, in the same lines as they did in the Kerala State Electricity Board, which I just described, and said that it was sufficient to guide the administrative authority for the purposes of rulemaking. Now, in my view, as I've been repeating it more and more often, this tendency has to stop. You have to hold the legislative body to its responsibility of enacting a legislation which makes it very clear, which indicates very clearly the purpose of the act, the policy behind the framing of the act, and leaving only bare minimum to the rulemaking authority to deal with the nitty-gritty. In other words, I mean, of course, nobody expects the legislative body to understand what is the reality on the ground in a particular area where the legislation is to operate. So maybe you can have an administrative authority going into those areas, and for the purposes of rulemaking and procedure, for filling up the details of the legislature. But you cannot abdicate your essential legislative function, which is determining the object of the very enactment and the policy that guides it. So these are the instances where the courts seem to be going too far to read in a legislative policy which is not otherwise there, and to permit the administrative authority or the rulemaking authority to read in a policy which was never there. And that, in my opinion, is something that we should refrain from doing. The second area of concern is with regard to the requirement of laying of rules before the legislature. Now, as I said earlier, this requirement of laying the rules before the legislature is one that is necessary or mandated for the purposes of control of delegated legislation by the legislative body itself. If you ask me, that is something that has to be encouraged, because if you encourage that, and if you ensure that the legislative body is functioning properly and even exercising its monitoring duties effectively, discharging its monitoring duties effectively, then you're straight away reducing the possibility of more and more cases coming into court challenging the delegated legislation. In fact, you're preventing such faulty rules from being made in the first instance. So the criteria, according to me, the procedure, it would be improper for the courts to say that the requirement of laying before the legislature, which is mentioned in the statute, is only directory and not mandatory. According to me, when the statute makes it clear that there is a requirement of laying the rules before the legislative body, that has to be read as mandatory, because we've all been told that when the statute prescribes a mode of doing a thing, it should be done in that manner and no other. Now this is basically you go hark back to 1942 Privy Council, Nazir and Emperor. These principles are there for a reason. They're to ensure that these legislative bodies discharge the functions assigned to them under the Constitution. Now, if you look at the decisions in this area also, you would see the three decisions again. Where the requirement of reading in, placing the Atlas Cycle Industries versus State of Haryana. The citation is 1979, 2 SCC 196. 1979, 2 SCC 196. Now, this is a case where if you find that there was a clause similar to the clauses that one normally finds in the statute, it said that every order by the central government or its officer shall be laid before both houses of parliament as soon as may be after it is made. And this requirement was held by the Supreme Court as being merely directory and not mandatory. Now, if more and more instances of these rules being read, these provisions being read as directory come to light, then according to me, we are shutting out an avenue of control of delegated legislation, which even the legislative body had recognized as essential for the purposes of controlling delegated legislation. So now these are my thoughts on the aspect of delegated legislation, and I'd be open to any discussion on what I've just stated. I may just conclude by stating that it has been a pleasure sharing my thoughts with persons I've interacted with on a long-term basis. I thank the Madras Tax Bar Association for giving me this opportunity to be with you so that I could share my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Lordships, for taking the session. Now the questions, I already see a few hands raised, and there are a few questions which came to me through messages also, sir. With your permission, Your Lordships, can I take up a few questions?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Senior Advocate Mr. Venkatraman sir has this question, sir. I'll just unmute him first. Venkataraman, good evening.
Yeah. Good evening.
Yes, Mr. Venkataraman.
Namaste, sir. First of all, a big thank you for finding the time to speak to our children. And also, there are your own colleagues, earlier colleagues, but a lot of children, very enthusiastic people are involved in this group. It's a big learning. It is a 5-year learning which has been condensed in 1 hour on administrative law. We are thankful to you for that. Number one. I have one doubt with you, which I thought I'll ask. You touched on it very poignantly, that the pressure on the court, we all talk about backlog, but it often happens because of executive pushing their responsibility into courts. That has been the normal view by anybody. Now, is it possible somewhere to start constituting a full bench? See, we are in an era where no organ should get into conflict with any other organ. We should not work in alignment. Can a full bench be constituted? Typical cases of bureaucratic red tapeism and avoidance of taking decision-making process be catalogued. 5 in number, 10 in number, 12 in number. Then take the executive into confidence. Draw up a roadmap. This can never happen through a legislation. And India still believes in an occupied field. Doctrine of occupied field can still, to best especially allowing administrative law to function. If a responsible catalog be prepared with their help and their consent, saying that this issue, this will be the solution. If this repeats again, then action should be internally initiated. If this protocol can be framed by the courts taking ideal problems, will it not in the long run push this burden back to the executive to function and in the process reduce the burden to courts?
Mr. Venkataraman, as a senior counsel and with your experience, you would realize that that exercise, even if done, would be honored more in breach. We have the Constitution, for crying out loud, which determines the roles that they have to play, and yet it is flagrantly violated. When a tahsildar or a corporate, the secretary of a corporation refuses to issue an order or an application or maybe a certificate, that is an abdication of his function. Now, if you ask, is it mandated that he must function? Of course, it is mandated. That's why he's an authority under the statute, which authorizes gives him the power to do it. But he does not do it. In a case of an abdication of power, and when it comes to court, the choice between the court is twofold. One, we close the writ petition by directing the authority to act. Alternatively, we say, okay, this person is not going to act, so we will act. Because the Constitutional Court can always step into the shoes and take it. But the question to be answered is it a desirable course of action? You may do it in a particular situation where you find that the urgency of the situation requires the court to act rather than sending him back to the authority for a decision and then coming back to court, which, if I may say so, seems to be the concern of the Supreme Court in most of the decisions where they have been fairly ready to read in the requirement of fairly ready to read in the principle that laying is only directory and not mandatory. Because suppose they were to hold it as mandatory, they would have to set aside those rules, declare that the rules are bad, and send it back to the authority for framing fresh rules. This would obviously take time, and that would not be in the interest of the litigant before them. So, it is probably to preserve the interest of, to further the interest of justice and the expediency of the situation that they have done it. But in the long run, the question is it desirable? Because you are creating, when the Supreme Court says this, it is a precedent. And under Article 141, it's biting on everybody. So, more and more of such rulings would tend to the lackadaisical attitude on the part of the legislature and the executive, which is not desirable.
Extremely thankful to you, sir, once again, for educating these children on a very, very dynamic subject and a growing subject. You have touched up to the cryptocurrency judgment in a sequence.
Yes.
Thanks for the help. Thanks for the help.
Cryptocurrency judgment is a treat to read for anybody interested in this subject.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Your Lordship. Thank you, Venkatraman sir. My lords, there are three more questions, my lords. With your permission, I'll just take them up quickly. My lords?
Yes.
Yes, my lords. Mr. Gokul Kishore. I'm just unmuting. Gokul sir?
Hello, yeah.
Yes, sir, you can ask your question, sir.
Good evening, my lord. I'm Gokul Kishore, advocate from Delhi. You touched on, yeah, good
You're
evening.
not visible. Is that deliberate or?
No, this camera is off. You can start your camera, Gokul sir.
Yeah, I'm doing it.
I'd rather speak to somebody I can see.
Yes.
Is it okay? I just post disabled. It says you have disabled sharing my screen.
No, not the screen, my lord.
Sorry,
Gokul sir.
sorry, start video. Sorry.
Yes.
Not video.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it is okay now.
Yeah,
Yes,
now-
sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Good evening, my lord. I'm Gokul Kishore, advocate from Delhi.
Yes.
You touched upon removal of difficulty orders.
Yes.
When you were talking, simultaneously I was typing in the chat box section 172 of the CGST Act, which empowers the central government to issue, on the recommendations of the GST Council, removal of difficulty orders.
Correct.
Orders are typically to be meant for the intention or the objective of these orders is to actually iron out the difficulties in implementation per se.
Implemented.
So, because in GST, the kind of teething troubles are not yet over. We have not even passed through the first phase of implementation. So, a lot of difficulties. So, a lot of date extensions are being given. Statutorily, certain dates have been prescribed. So, these orders are being repeatedly issued to extend the dates for various compliances.
Correct.
So, my question to you, my lord, is these.
That's out.
I wrote an article also on this because I am a bit perturbed when when an officer in CBEC amends the Parent Act because they keep on adding provisos to the relevant sections. So can we call it as an excessive delegation? Because typically, as my lord said, this also has the same provision that these are to be laid in the table of the Parliament. So that is there, of course. But as my lord said, these are the kind of control the Parliament exercises over these kind of removal of difficulty orders at a later stage is everybody knows what is the kind of control that legislature exercises over these orders.
So let me try and answer that in two stages. First, when you're talking about the removal of difficulties power that is conferred on a person.
Yes.
The first and foremost question that you have to see is this power conferred in the backdrop of a statutory provision which makes clear the objects and the purposes of the enactment? If that is already done, then there is no delegation of the legislative power to the lower authority.
Okay.
In other words, he's only determining certain areas of operation or extension of the time period, etc. That would not come within the ambit of delegated legislation. It would come under conditional legislation, which is what I started with.
Exactly.
Conditional legislation, unlike delegated legislation, there is no transfer of legislative power. There is no delegation of legislative power. So once the legislative power is exhausted and the legislation comes in, the authority who is granted the power to remove difficulties is essentially only saying that this should be extended for a certain period. And that can be done through a proviso, etc. Now, the proviso, however, would come in only by an amendment to the legislation itself, unless the instrument under which the proviso comes is itself a delegated legislation, instrument of delegated legislation. So, ultimately, your question is relevant and it is valid because number of instances where people come to court, and I've seen writ petitions drafted on these lines, where the fine distinction between a conditional legislation and a delegated legislation is missed out. So when you challenge, as I said earlier in the talk, when you challenge a conditional legislation, the authority is basically functioning like a administrative authority. And therefore, you need to read in the principles of natural justice for checking any action of his.
Yeah.
In the case of a delegated legislation, however, you can't do that, because he's essentially discharging a legislative function. So I think it would have to be gone on a case-to-case basis. You have to see what the parent statute says. If the parent statute is sufficiently clear in laying down its objects and policies, and the removal of difficulties power is given only in those circumstances, then I don't see any harm in having such a clause there. In fact, you would find this even in the foreign trade policy where the Director General of Foreign Trade has given the power to remove difficulties and things. Something that most of the indirect tax bar association would be more familiar with. And we've all wrestled with this order.
Thank you, Miller. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Lordships. Thank you, sir. Sir, I'm going to unmute Sundareswaran, sir. Sundareswaran, good evening.
Good evening, sir. This is with regard to the power of the delegated registration under the rules. If the parent registration uses the word in such manner as may be prescribed, whether the rule can prescribe the time limit, would it be vitiated on the ground that excessive delegation?
No, sorry, I didn't get if the parent statute says?
If the parent statute says, it says that, and I'm just coming straight to the point, it is a transitional arrangement of input tax credit from erstwhile parent act to GST. 141 says existing law in such manner as may be prescribed. It doesn't prescribe the time limit within which the Tran 1 form has to be filed for availing the input tax credit. Now what happens is the rule prescribes the time limit. Whether this could be challenged on the ground of excessive delegation.
Are you asking me for legal advice? Because I'm sitting on the wrong end.
I am standing only for departments. I just want your opinion.
I should not be commenting on that.
No. I'm just want your opinion. That's all.
My opinion is valuable, Mr. Sundaresh.
Grateful.
My opinion should not be expressed in platforms like this.
No, it won't be. It is for my satisfaction.
No, I can't answer that question.
Yes. I'll take up the final questions from Mr. Jayakumar.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I'm not able to answer these questions.
No, my lord, absolutely not, my lord.
Sitting where I am now, it would not be proper.
Yes, my lord. Jayakumar, sir.
Millard, Justice Jaishankar,
Yes.
nice hearing you. You had a fantastic analysis of all the topics. Just to answer Sundareshan's point, we had one problem in income tax. The rules mentioned about filing of Form 10, giving time limit. The Madras High Court has struck down saying you can't prescribe time limit. It's a very old decision. Millard, the one interesting question I have is, for example, one provision in Income Tax Act regarding cash payment under 48(3). It says the rules will give the parameters. Now, one rule called Rule 6DD, which says genuine circumstances. Now, that particular Rule 6DDJ was removed. There was an interesting question arose, what is the intention of the legislature? Now, if you want to read the section, you have the Finance Minister's speech, you have memorandum explaining bill. When it comes to rules, there is no intention of ascertaining that particular why it was removed. I'll try to give one parallel. The recent judgment of the Supreme Court in Exide case of income tax in section 43B. The Supreme Court says if the intention is not ascertainable, only strict rule will apply. So in these circumstances, supposing I have genuinely incurred certain expenses, which was earlier, I can escape, there was an escape formula was there. And now, because that is denied, people said that rule can be challenged. But all over India, it was challenged. And overall, they say the delegate legislation was proper. My question, my lord, is that if you're sitting as a judge, how will you find out the intention of making a rule without referring to the Parent Act?
No, I would not look at the intention of framing the rule because, see, there is no intention for framing a rule. A framing of a rule is consequential to the intention already expressed by the legislature in the Parent Act. So if the Act says that a rule must be framed to further the objects of the Act, then the rulemaking authority is only discharging the function that is assigned to him. And he does not have any independent intention behind the framing of the rule. So he acts in accordance with the discipline and the parameters that are already fixed by the parent legislation. So he's virtually like like an agent of a principal. The principal tells what to do and the agent does it. There's an element of discretion that is given to the agent in the manners in how he does it. But he has to do exactly what the principle is designed or decided to do. So when you're talking about the challenge to a rule, as I said earlier, you can either challenge it only on the ground. I mean, you can challenge it only on the ground. You can challenge the rule itself on the ground, that or the rule-making power on the ground, that it amounts to an excessive delegation of the power of legislation. The rule itself, you can challenge only on the ground that it is against the object of the act, or on any of the tests of judicial review, including proportionality. So that aspect is a tricky one, and which is lost sight of in most petitions, I find. As also the aspect of nomenclature, because many people challenge circulars, guidelines, assuming it to be a part of delegated legislation, or assuming it to be part just of an administrative order, thinking it is only an administrative order. Merely because the word used is guideline, it need not be only it may or may not have a statutory force, in the sense it may be traceable to a power of delegated legislation. So I think the safest way to tread in these matters is to trace, before you begin to challenge the particular instrument or the document, to trace the document to the power, and power, if any, available under the statute. If it does not have the power, if it is not traceable to any power exercised under the statute, then you can safely assume that it is administrative in nature. You challenge it on any of those grounds.
Yes, sir. Taking the clue from Senior Advocate Venkatraman, I'm one of the child who wants to learn from you.
I'm a child learning from
so the last thing is, like you correctly advised, in these circumstances, they should have formed a committee as to why that particular rule should have been dropped.
Correct.
I think that will be the best endeavor for the Lordship.
But then the committees are a dime a dozen. You see, we have grown up on this thing of forming committees, subcommittees. Nobody acts, which is it's an exasperating situation today, where you have more and more committees and nothing happens in these committees.
Quite right. Thanks so much, sir.
Thank you, sir. Sir, Natarajan sir just wants to come in and add a few points.
Yeah.
Natarajan sir, I've unmuted you.
Yeah, thank you, Lordship, for your wonderful session. Your forthrightness was visible all through along, whether pointing out your views when the Supreme Court said that laying before the Parliament was only directory, expressing your Lordship for reservations on that, your Lordship for forthright. At the same way, when any particular question is touching upon a live matter, your Lordship was forthright in saying that it is not inappropriate for your Lordship to answer. That forthrightness was throughout the session, and we enjoyed it, your Lordship. And as your Lordship said, we all thought that when it comes to the question of control of delegated legislation, it will be about the judicial review process. And your Lordship has correctly pointed out there is another method of control of legislative delegated legislation. But the reason why we have forgot that was, it is quite obvious. And how we know how much, even though the rules were framed, even the acts are being passed by guillotine. So how far these rules will be read by the Parliament and all, these are all the issues which we have to keep in mind. And thank you, Lordship. And now, Prithvi, you can invite for a formal vote of thanks, Mr. Satish.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you very much, Natarajan. My lords, with your permission, I'll invite Mr. Satish Sundar to propose a formal vote of thanks.
Satish is muted.
I'm just trying to. Yes, Satish sir, can you?
Yeah, can
Yes,
you
sir.
hear me? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So on behalf of the Madras Tax Bar, thank you very much, sir. It was a very illuminating lecture. And as Senior Venkatraman said, a lot of youngsters would have definitely benefited by it. As also seniors like us. It was a very nice lecture.
Thank
And
you.
so thanks for homecoming again. And
Thank you. Thank you, Satish.
we hope to see you more on such webinars soon with us. Thank you.
It was indeed a homecoming. Thank you. Thank you to all.
Thank you very much, Satish sir. Thank you, my lords, again for your valuable time for taking up this session and for patiently answering our queries also. I once again thank you, my lord, on behalf of Madras Tax Bar. And the participants, thanks for joining us today. We have recorded this session, and we will be uploading it on our YouTube channel also. You can subscribe to YouTube channel Madras Tax Bar Chennai. Thank you once again to all the participants. I'm ending the session now. Thank you, my lord.
Thank you.